Welcome everyone to History Online again. We're going to meet sometime or another. Feel like I'll have to introduce myself when we meet in person Monday, crossing my fingers, for the first time in over a month. My name is Mr. Vipperman, Mr. Chuck if you prefer. This is week 17 of history, and when we meet in class Monday, obviously we're going to have a lot to go over, and we will do it the best we can. I am planning on putting together a quiz next on Monday for you to complete before the end of next week, just so we can sort of keep in touch with where we're going here. We're slipping into the third quarter of our lessons, and right now chronologically, we're kind of moving. If this was the Dark Ages, early Dark Ages, we're moving into the latter Dark Ages, getting ready to slip a little bit into the medieval period by the end of this year. And again, we've been talking about a lot of people, a lot of events, a lot of places. And again, I'm trying to make sure that at every opportunity we point to those common threads that we can see about the development of these nations, these peoples, and try to make it more than just a list of who, what, where, when. Try to connect the dots, so to speak. As we move from the early to the late Dark Ages, we will see a little bit more in the way of nation forming. We talked about a couple of weeks ago the kingdom of the Franks and the formation of the Holy Roman Empire. We're going to see a little bit more of that as we continue on here, as again we start getting into geographically and numerically much larger nation states, and we're going to see kind of a furthering away from the Roman Empire mindset into a more medieval mindset. I'll try to point out the opportunities where they present themselves, but for the time being, again, as far as these video lessons are concerned, we're going to be mainly focused with people, places, and things. I'm going to open up this week on the island of Iceland. Kind of a misnomer. If you're familiar with upper Atlantic geography at all, you know Iceland is very small, Greenland is very big. Greenland ain't got much green on it. Iceland's got a lot of green. Now, the upper third of it is pretty icy most of the year, but there are some lush fields in the southern two-thirds of Iceland, and because of that, remember we talked a couple of weeks ago about the Vikings leaving their places in Scandinavia, trying to look for places to land, places to raid. Of course, they needed to feed their families. But they found a pretty good place here in Iceland. The problem is it was a small island that was not discovered until around the year 860. And even then, it was a little while before the Vikings began to immigrate to Iceland to make it really their home. Mostly, again, the three groups of the Vikings, the Norwegian, the Swedish, and the Danish Vikings, mostly the Norwegian Vikings were the ones who settled the island of Iceland. About around 874 is the first evidence we have of any permanent Viking settlements on Iceland. But within 60 years, there were several thousand Vikings. Again, a very popular place. There was land to be farmed, and it was there were some scattered indigenous presence there, not much. And by the year 930, it's estimated that 20,000 Vikings were living in Iceland. That's a major migration for this time, and because the boat journeys were not always 100% reliable, they began to set up regions in Iceland that they called things. Things, things. And each thing had a chief who helped to settle disputes in that geographic region. In times, the regions came together to form basically a parliament. They called it the Althing. I'm not kidding. Althing. These things, all things, was the parliament, which made the rules, was the legislative arm for the entire island. And the Parliament of Iceland is still called the Althing. Honest to God. Sometimes referred to Iceland as the land of ice and fire. Again, the upper third of the nation is mostly snow-covered, ice-covered, very Arctic. The southern two-thirds features a whole bunch of volcanoes. Iceland has, on a per square foot basis, the most volcanoes of any island in the world. For this contrast of hot and cold, it's called the land of fire and ice. Some parts of the northern Iceland have the midnight sun, again, because they're so far north. They have a few days in the winter where it's dark all day, a few days in the summer where it's light all day. Again, there was more farmland there, but it was not unlimited. It was very limited, but it was some. And they still, to this day, depend upon neighbors for grain and other products to feed the livestock that is grown there. Iceland is a place I would love to visit. If you look at some of the vistas there, it's like Norway. I mean, there's just some breathtaking geography there. It seems like a really cool place. If you could imagine a globe of the Earth, if Iceland's up here, if you were to bore right through the center of the Earth, you would come out on the other side of the world in New Zealand. It is the exact polar global opposite of Iceland. It is in the South Pacific. It is basically 3 big islands and a whole bunch of little islands, and it laid undiscovered for many, many years. We're going to be talking about the native New Zealanders a lot in this chapter, the Maori people, the Maori, the Maori. And they were and are a fascinating people. They first arrived in New Zealand sometime around, it's hard to say, 900 to 1300. Again, New Zealand is one of the largest of the South Pacific islands. But again, looking at the geography, there are about 30,000 islands in this vast region of the South Pacific, the Polynesian region, and some of them are beautiful. I am just still to this day fascinated with what's called atolls, these lips of volcanoes that just barely come up out of the ground and have just a little bit of circular land that people do live on. They're just geographically fascinating to me, and there are hundreds of them in the South Pacific. I mean, there's some islands that are no bigger than Gilligan's Island. I mean, they're just tiny, but and you can see where it would be hard for a common culture to develop from island to island because it's not easy to get around there. But there was a culture that developed in the South Pacific, and the Maori were almost certainly those who came from some of these smaller Polynesian islands who found New Zealand and all of its, of course, land and arable land, again, land that could be farmed, and settled it. They, at about the same time, we start seeing some of the British explorers who start exploring the South Pacific, discover these islands, and that will intersect here in a second. But New Zealand today is considered part of Oceania. That is New Zealand, Australia, and about 30,000 other islands out in the South Pacific. Because it was a remote island, it developed some very unique wildlife. If you're familiar with Charles Darwin's studies, they took place on the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America because there were some species there, non-avian, that could not leave the island. So they developed completely independently of other species, and there was some weird stuff there. Yeah, there's some weird stuff in New Zealand. They have more flightless birds than any other continent, even Australia. So much like Iceland, it had a whole lot of geysers, credible scenery. So again, literally clear across the world from Iceland, another culture was developing here in New Zealand. And again, the Maoris we know a lot about them because, again, they still exist. Maori culture is still a thing in New Zealand. As a matter of fact, on New Year's Day, because of the international timeline, the first area to welcome in the new year is New Zealand. And they have the traditional haka dance that the Maori people perform to welcome in the new year. It's always very popular. If If you're watching CNN at 2 a.m. on December 31st here, they'll have live coverage of the New Year's Haka dance in New Zealand on several of the islands. The Maoris were probably visually most noted for their face art, face tattooing. And it was more than just an art form. It was part of their culture. Your station in life. Someone could literally look at your facial markings and tell most of your life story. There were life events that were depicted on the facial tattoos. I'm not willing to do that. I hope I can change things, but just because I was born here doesn't mean anyway, you get the idea. But it became more than just an art form, and indeed the moko, the face artist, tattoo artists, were less tattoo artists and more clerics and priests. They believed that these artists were endowed with their gifts from God, and getting your face tattooed to signify major life events, or your station. If you were a king, you had certain markings. If you were a royal family member, you had certain markings. Again, it became almost a quasi-religious practice, and they were very good about having art depicting them. So we have lots of examples of what the Maori looked like at this time. Again, we mentioned the Haka, the sacred war dance, which is featured prominently in Maori culture. They were known also. Jade was plentiful in New Zealand, and they used it for everything. Something that was very rare in Europe. Jade was very prized. It was plentiful there. So again, remember our El Dorado example, the land of gold, where all the rocks were gold, so they didn't value it like we did, where it was not that plentiful. Yeah, same thing. And you can imagine when the Europeans came there and found all that jade, they went cha-ching. We would like that. The Maori people, again, you'll see lots of parallels to the development of North America here, where there was a native population that existed when European settlers came in. European settlers had the bigger guns, and they eventually won the continent, and those struggles occurred in New Zealand as well. It was completely unknown, was New Zealand, to Europeans until the year 1642. A Dutch explorer named Abel Tasman, Tasmanian Islands nearby? Yeah, that's him. He named the island New Zealand after the province in the Netherlands. However, this is funny, he was terrified at the sight of the Maoris with the face art and everything, and he never actually landed on the island. Evidently, he saw them from a distance and said, I ain't touching those. Anyway, that's kind of funny. But yeah, years later, Captain James Cook, a British explorer, came with him and brought about 100 pigs, the legend goes, and it was something that was not native to New Zealand, so he introduced pigs to the island, and evidently got into enough good graces. But like I said, over the next couple of 100 years, there were the inevitable tensions between the colonists and the natives. A lot of analogies to what we've experienced here and what a lot of other nation states have experienced up and down South and Central America. We'll get into more of that later chronologically. We're skipping way ahead here with New Zealand. But anyway, and today, much like with America, the Maori culture, people now are really trying to preserve it, and it's more than just a piece of history. It's a way of life. All right, we're going to go to our third continent of the day and talk briefly about Africa. Again, most of the development we've talked about, and again, most of what we're going to explore is Europe in general and Western Europe in particular, but there was a lot going on in Africa. Africa is bigger than the United States and Europe combined. And in Africa, again, even though most of a good 60-70% of the land is desert, not arable, again, not suitable for farming, so it's not going to spawn a whole lot of civilization. There was quite a bit of civilization there. We are most familiar, of course, with Egypt, and the reason that Egypt was a thriving region was because of the Nile River. The Nile was fertile, and you could grow stuff around it, and so a civilization sprung up around it. A little further south, what has been called several things, but mostly the nation of Nubia. It's where Sudan is now. It is the southern end of the Nile, and it's not quite as fertile as it is in the Delta region in Egypt, but it was fertile enough to sustain life. And the kingdom of Cush began to form around the lower part of the Nile, the more southern part of the Nile. There's evidence that the Nubians had an active enough society to trade with China, which geographically was a very, very major undertaking. About 2,000, 3,000 miles away. Like the Egyptians, there are some Nubian pyramids that you can still see today. But again, one of the great mysteries of history, at around the year 250 AD, they disappeared. Or at least we don't have any records of them after that. There's no historic consensus on exactly what happened, just that we don't have evidence of the kingdom of Cush, of the Nubian people, really after the year 250. A little further out from the Nubian people, the people of the Nok, N-O-K, now in the area known as Nigeria, which is more or less Central Africa. Again, they made some really wild art of a whole lot of face art. These elongated faces, you've probably seen pictures of them. That's mostly the Nok people. Again, about 1,500 BC, and again, much like with the Nubians, around the year 250 AD, there's no record of them existing beyond that. Very odd. Again, lots of theories, of course, a whole bunch of theories, but really no settled historic fact on what happened to the Nok. One nation that we do know a lot about around this time period, maybe a little bit later, is a country that still exists, Zimbabwe. And about the year 900, they became more than just a collection of people. They became a kingdom, quite literally the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. Around between the years, say, 900 and 1100, the people of Zimbabwe evidently dedicated themselves to some incredible architecture. They still stand today. The most amazing thing about Zimbabwe architecture is that it's still standing today, 1,000 years later, and they did not have mortar. The stones were cut so perfectly and laid so well that they did not require mortar, and they are still standing. It is remarkable. The very word Zimbabwe means house of stone, and boy, you can really, if something can stand the weather for 1,000 years and you didn't have to have mortar to keep it together, you built something very, very special. There's a 100-acre area in what was then the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe, that where a lot of this architecture still stands. There's a group of stones called the Hill Ruins, stand about 300 feet above all the others. Small rooms, wall, this natural cave. It echoes, like you would expect. Is really cool. Now, the south of that is the Elliptical Building, which is probably the most recognizable, probably home to a king. 32-foot high walls, 16 feet thick in some places. These guys did not have bulldozers to move these rocks, which weighed thousands of tons, I am sure. It's within the Elliptical Building, you'll find these tall, cone-shaped towers, curved and tapered, which, again, it boggles the mind to figure out how they could have done this without modern machinery. Absolutely incredible. Now, between the hill and the elliptical, or the Valley of Ruins, 10 different structures there. The mud huts and things like that. But at each location, these stone ruins were made of granite and cut precisely enough, again, to lie on top of one another without mortar. Nothing connecting them except the expert manner in which they were cut and placed. It is remarkable. About 10,000 people, historians believe, occupied Greater Zimbabwe, and again, strong trade evidence there of trade routes with Nubia And I'm not sorry, not Nubia, but Egypt in particular, but even beyond the African continent. Plentiful gold in this area, so again, you can see where they would have a lot to trade with Europe. Again, a whole lot of people and places here. We skipped all across the globe in this week's lesson. On Monday, we will try to cobble together 3 weeks worth of lessons into a discussion. So be ready to talk. We'll see you Monday.